So the next panel, I have to actually say this very slowly. I can't say it 3 times fast because the title is alliterative. It's Rethinking Rare, Resolutions for Reinvention in a Genomic Age. We have a tremendous group of panelists, and we have an absolutely wonderful moderator who's been engaged with USAIC for several years now, and that's Tim Yu. Tim Yu is a professor at Harvard Medical School at Children's Hospital. He has an affiliation at the Broad. Tim is a neurogeneticist, a clinician, and a scientist, and he's dedicated his life to really understanding neurogenetic rare diseases. And Tim is really a leader, if not the leader, in really driving a new area of medicine, and that's N of 1 therapies. In fact, in large measure, because of Tim's innovations, we have our name, which is from N of 1, this meeting's name, from N of 1 to N of a billion. So with that said, Tim, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Andy and Karun, for hosting this wonderful event, and a hat tip to the title as well. It's my great honor to share this panel stage with the real stars of the show. I'm joined here by a number of folks in the industry, representing perspectives from industry, nonprofits, patients, and government. And we're looking forward to a fantastic discussion. I will first quickly remind folks to participate, please, in the online poll for this particular panel. It's open now. It will be open throughout the duration of the panel, and it'll close 1 minute after this panel is over. And as you saw in the previous section, we'll see the results as perhaps influenced by the insightful comments from the group. So without further ado, let me first announce the theme and then do quick panelist introductions, and then quickly get to the people you want to hear from our panelists. The theme of this group is to discuss the question of rare disease. And you all have seen the off-cited statistics of there being at least 7,000 genetic diseases. And as of last count, some 500 FDA-approved treatments. And those are pretty bleak numbers. On the other hand, at least from where I sit as a scientist and in academia, the scientific prospects are incredibly rosy. From innovations like genome sequencing and genomically targeted interventions, we're getting much more sophisticated. I wanted to start this panel off by addressing the question, well, is that promise going to be fulfilled, and how long will it take? How are we doing? To answer this question, I'm really honored to be here with Al Sandrock, CEO of Voyager Therapeutics, Charlene Sung Rigby, CEO of RareX, Paula Soteropoulos, Chairman of the Board of Ensoma, Philip Larsen, the Global Head of Research at Bayer, and Max Bronstein, the Assistant Director for Health Innovation in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Thank you for joining us as panelists. We also have some special guests here, Barry Tycho and Lena Williamson, who will be contributing too. So to get us kicked off, let's start with a pulse check. How are we doing with scientific prospects like I described? What's life out there in the real world? And are we able to make the impact that we want? To start off, what are we doing right in the space? And I thought I'd invite Paula to take first crack at that.
Sure. Pleasure to be here, by the way, and thanks for having me join this panel. There is a lot we're doing right in terms of rare disease, but with that said, there's a lot more to go. As I think about my 30 plus years focused on rare diseases, we had a small few diseases that we're focused on, and there are so many today. So I think the focus in rare disease has expanded broadly. There was a time which still happens a bit, where you look at every company is almost going after the same rare diseases. And what's really great is innovation has been, I think, tested and applied more broadly across more rare diseases. I think most people in the world are affected by a rare disease, or someone they know has a rare disease. So this is not an issue of just a few. And so I think really being able to use that innovation across many more diseases, not just going after the same ones. And I think also starting to find solutions for those smaller diseases, the ends of ones that may not be commercially viable, but finding a path to a solution for them. I think we have a ways to go with regard to accessibility and market access for these, but I do think the addressing various diseases through innovative technologies, we've come a long way.
Thank you, Paula. That's a great summation. So many innovative technologies, and seeing the reach spreading out further. Philip, I thought I might ask you to also tee up and answer the same question.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I think the biggest sort of contribution we've seen collectively between medical community, patient engagement societies, and the pharmaceutical industry is that we've shown over the past 10, 15 years that it's actually possible to bring medicines to single individuals based on insights from the genetic revolution, you could say. But it's also sort of a change that had helped the pharmaceutical industry in particular to show that it can once again bring much more attractive sort of value propositions, not only to patients, but also to investors. So entering into rare disorders, discovery and clinical development has helped sort of completely overhaul the industry and become yet again much more successful in what we're doing. We had lackluster probability of technical successes that were way below 5% in many disease areas, and all of a sudden that's totally flipped. And that's because the biological insights to disease has improved so phenomenally over the past decade. So now we can design in a much more rational way therapeutic interventions that simply wasn't possible just a decade ago. So that bodes well. But it's also created a problem, and that problem is not only about access, but we can also become too successful, so to speak, that at the end of the day, that's not happening anytime soon, but at the end of the day, we would have an expensive therapy for practically any disease. And it's pretty clear that the entire system will not be able, with current prices, to actually afford that. So there is a challenge, and we need to figure out, how we can make these medicines available to patients at a reasonable cost, but also at the same time at an investment that's currently much lower than what we currently spend.
You touched a little bit on being a victim of our own success, and that we're discovering these conditions as well as the treatments at a pace that we hadn't before. I wonder, Charlene, in your work at RareX, you've spent time actually doing a better job at cataloging these conditions. And would you like to expand on that point that Philip raised?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And Philip talked about biological insights enabling us to develop, better treatments. And I think that, those biological insights also, help us to start with understanding what the basis for a disorder is. And the 7,000 disorders that you mentioned at the beginning of the panel, we've done some research that we just released actually in June through our Be Counted project, where we've identified that there are over 10,000 rare diseases. And so that's significantly up from the 5,000 to 8,000 range that we've really been using for the last decade. And this is largely due to our ability to differentiate diseases based on genetics. So now, where we thought we had a single disease before, we can see that there's individual diseases based on different genetic etiologies. And we saw this, I think, first really in cancer, where we understood this best in cancer initially, where cancers were traditionally categorized based on organ. And so now we know that, for instance, in breast cancer, there's actually multiple cancers based on the molecular differences. And we're starting to see this in many different disorders. And so one of the interesting insights from this piece of research was that 61% of those 10,000 rare diseases had a known genetic cause, and 25% had a suspected or likely genetic cause. So that's almost 90% of those disorders.
That's really pretty remarkable. And the first step, of course, to developing an intervention is grouping the patients and identifying the meaningful groupings in the first place. So that is a really remarkable contribution that you've made already there, Charlene. Thank you. Anyone else? Any other notable successes or things that are going well that anyone would like to cover?
Tim, if I may jump in here, I'd love to just say a quick word about a little bit about the historical context here, because I think a lot of the success in rare disease can actually be attributed to a point in time in the 1980s when the Orphan Drug Act was passed. And I say that because this is something that really created the incentive framework that ultimately helped undergird and really launch the industry. So I think we have seen really substantial progress over the last 38 years, but major challenges remain. And I say that because, on the good news side of the equation, I think our diagnostic capabilities are becoming much more sophisticated, which I think is great news for patients. But the flip side of that means the disease count is going to continue to rise. And so the numbers that we're hearing today the number of diseases are going to far outpace the number of treatments. So I think we have a lot of work to do on the therapeutic side of the equation. And I would also add that, if you look at today's landscape, we're struggling here just to ensure equitable access to products that are already FDA approved. So I definitely think we have our work cut out for us here.
I'd like to point out, Tim, the great success for one disease in particular, spinal muscular atrophy. When I was training, if you had told me that we would have these treatments, antisense oligonucleotide, as well as gene therapy, that would transform the treatment of SMA as we have today, I would not have believed you. But combined with newborn screening, if we start treatment early enough, these children, these babies, for type 1, babies who would have had type 1 SMA, instead of dying by age 2, they're not only alive, but they're literally walking or even running. It's just unbelievable. So the technology, the knowledge of the disease, the identification of these children at birth, it's just unbelievable what the technology and what our industry has done.
Tim, I want to add one more thing, completely agree with what Al said. The other area that has really strengthened, I think, is the voice of the patient and families. I think that we see tremendous efforts, moving mountains by these patients and families that have also pushed us from a technology standpoint. So I do think that is worth mentioning because they are very strong advocates and also driving research as well.
The advancements in SMA would not have been possible without the involvement of the SMA Foundation and Cure SMA, who work hand in hand with the NIH and with the companies.
And I just want to add to that this is becoming, this patient initiation of research is becoming more and more important as we start to go into the rare disorders and into the tail. And, as both Paula and Al mentioned, there's been significant patient investment, and this can be from funding a mouse to actually initiating therapy development and funding it from the patients. And I think that it's a really interesting trend that basically the patient communities are actually de-risking therapy development so that they make it more attractive for industry. And this is going to become, I think, more and more important as we get toward the tail of tail of diseases.
Thank you, Charlene. In a way, I think that patient empowerment is one of the amazing superpowers that are enabled once you've named the diagnosis, allow a community to form and to build and to collaborate. Would you like to elaborate a little bit more about what you're doing at RareX to make that happen even faster?
Yeah, absolutely. And I should actually give a little bit of background in terms of kind of my path to RareX. So I've spent much of my career building software applications for analysis of healthcare data. And about 5 years ago, my daughter, my second child, was diagnosed with a rare neurodevelopmental disorder, STXBP1. And at the time, there were only a couple hundred patients in the world who had been diagnosed. And so now my daughter is 9. Actually, today is her birthday. And so that really led us on this path to start to understand, what does it mean to be a patient advocate, and what do you have to do to kickstart research and start to characterize a very, very small and new disorder. And what really struck me was that we were doing this. So the STXBP1 Foundation was doing this, and there were many, many other disorders that were in a similar point of maturity that were also kickstarting their own efforts around disease characterization, building registries, and starting to characterize their disease. And we were all doing it in bespoke ways and learning different lessons in ways that weren't really as scalable if I put my software architect hat on. And so I was just really delighted last year to join the RareX team, where what we are doing is we have built a platform for collecting patient-reported data across rare disorders. And we're doing this in, I want to emphasize that we're doing this in a disease-agnostic way, so that we're not assuming that a patient has any particular symptoms. And this is important, especially for early characterization of a disease where we don't really understand what the spectrum of symptoms are. And the other piece of what we're doing is we are a nonprofit, and so we are also a patient advocacy organization, and we truly are working to bring the voice of the patients and give them a seat at the table for research. So patients are able to determine how they want to share their data and for what types of research they want to share their data. And at the same time, we're really working to deburden patients so they don't have to become experts in data governance, research protocols, survey methodology, and all of those things that really require specialized expertise, and they can really focus on enabling their community to characterize their disorder.
That sounds like an amazing effort, a real bottom-up approach to enabling change. I think that might be a good segue to then for us to touch more on some of the challenges that we face. Again, under the model of successes like SMA and Spinraza and several other drugs to follow, now demonstrating what's possible to actually reach to smaller and smaller populations, and to replicate that process gets harder and harder. Al, could I invite you to comment a little bit about the challenges, whether it's logistical or financial or scientific?
Yeah, I think we're in a very tough market right now. Some have described it as a nuclear winter. It's probably the worst since 2008 or perhaps even 2002 in terms of the capital markets and the ability to finance R&D in the biotech industry. And I worry that the rare disease programs may end up getting deprioritized. I'm aware of some companies that have had to stop or at least pause programs that have even gone past phase 1 because some investors have said, even if they're successful, in other words, even if they're 100% certain to be approved, they wouldn't make money and are being pressured. That's a sad situation, because just at a time when the technology and the great advancements in genetics and biology and the technology has offered all these huge promises for patients, we may have to stop programs. And so that's a big concern of mine, and it keeps me up at night, actually. And so I'm starting to wonder, what are the solutions, to meet these challenges that you referred to, Tim? And so if you're talking about return on investment, there's sort of only a few ways to deal with it. One is to reduce the investment, which would either mean reducing the cost or shortening the time. And, even with all the advancements in genetics and everything, we still kind of do a lot of things the old-fashioned way. When we do clinical trials, we still do clinical trial monitoring the old-fashioned way. A lot of the clinical measurements are kind of the old-fashioned way. You know, we do timed 25-foot walk. I mean, it's almost ridiculous when we have potential technologies that could help us assess gait and things. And so anything we can do to make it more expedient in terms of getting data. You know, I mean, for many of these single gene diseases, we should have, the promise is that we would have large effect sizes, right? Because we know what the key issue is. We know the key biology we have to address, and we have very powerful technologies to address that biology. So we have the promise of large effect sizes, but if we have imprecise clinical measurement tools, it may still take a long time to see it, or be cumbersome to see it. So anyway, so maybe that's one way to reduce the cost and the time to get to approval. And then in terms of revenue, you know, return on that investment. So the revenue side, you know, obviously volume is low, so it's price times volume, right? And it's rare, so that's why on the volume side, there's not a whole lot you can do. Although I do think there are some of these rare diseases that actually link into more common diseases. For example, I'll give you one example, like if you have a homozygous mutation in GBA, you get Gaucher's, but if you have heterozygous mutations, you get, if you're a carrier for GBA, you get Parkinson's. So you can think about how you may learn about treating a lysosomal storage disease like Gaucher's that could help you think about a larger disease and perhaps provide opportunities for a larger disease. But I do think we have to address price, you know, and why is it that there's a cap on price? I don't understand. What's more about what is worth? I mean, why isn't it worth? What's a child's price? What's more important to pay for than a child, the child's health and life? So I think that's a political question, obviously, and maybe Max would have something to say about it. But it seems to me that society has to end up deciding whether or not there really should be a cap on price. I don't know. But if it's going to inhibit programs that are already in the clinic even from progressing, it's a debate that needs to be had, I believe.
Can I jump in here? So would love to pick up on some of the themes that Al mentioned. And Al mentioned that we've seen some incredible progress in certain disease areas, some of the more common rare diseases. And Al talked about SMA, and not only with SMA, but others. I think we're on the verge of having multiple FDA-approved treatments and possibly even cures for some of those, which is fantastic news for patients who have those conditions. But there are some patients who have subtypes of those more common rares or ultra rare N of 1, who in those patients are basically going to be left behind, and it's already happening to some degree. So to speak to some of these questions out here about cost, I really do think a new drug development paradigm is going to be needed to serve those types of patients. So what that means is, we might be looking at things like nonprofit collaboratives in the future. It could be public-private partnerships rather than sort of traditional privately funded and privately held biotech firms. So in addition to that, I think we're going to need to see a lot of research innovation happen specifically in how we develop drugs so that we can develop them more quickly, more safely, and ultimately at lower cost if we want to scale some of these approaches to treat these thousands of conditions that we honestly just don't have good solutions for right now. So we'll need to see innovation on that side, but also in the manufacturing process as well. So if we can figure out how to bend the cost curve in those places, I think we will be much better positioned to really scale our approach to drug development and ultimately broaden access and make it more equitable for patients as well.
I would agree with that. We see a lot of redundancies, and it's sort of piling up in clumps, if you like, where you have, perhaps excess investment in manufacturing capacity in some areas and, insufficient in other areas. You can ask yourself, do we need the number of gene editing companies that have been invested in over the past 5 years? Is that really, the wisest way? Typically, we would let the markets decide where people would have an interest in investing, and I'm pretty sure it will readjust to some extent. But there are certain initiatives that are probably taken better care of because the risk is so high through public-private partnership or through, big initiatives such as, the warp drive we saw, very successfully solve, vaccination in COVID and similar initiatives, because we cannot sort of neglect the medical needs and all of the patients with rare disorders. So we also have to invest, with wiser and with more insights. And I think we can start such initiatives and still keep the momentum.
Yeah,
I love this idea.
Go ahead, Tim. Well, I was just going to say that, Philip, one of the things that makes me think about is success breeds success. And that's why when there's success in a particular indication area, there's, a lot of investment in it and, or in a particular new technology. But what we, I think, need to figure out is how we scale this across the, 10,000 and growing number of disorders, because today we have this really slow process where we have one disease at a time going through its development and then clinical trials process. And we have, a growing number of diseases. It's almost like a backlog that's never going to end. And so how do we, I think that the question we need to wrangle with is how do we scale in a way that is going to be meaningful? Like right now, there are platform efforts or efforts to build up platforms, the NIH, PaveGT, and the Bespoke Gene Therapy Consortium have been launched, but they're both dealing with, 4 to 6 disorders right now. And so those are important. I don't want to minimize the importance of those efforts, but we need to figure out how to take it from 4 to 4,000, and 10,000. And so I think that's, the thing that needs to, especially from a patient perspective, think that needs to happen, over the next, 5 years and hopefully sooner.
I thought that this discussion about platforms is very near and dear to my heart. It also reminds me of some conversations I was having with Barry in the prep for this discussion. Barry, would you like to comment? I'm wondering about whether or not Max alluded to ARPA-H and that being a driver of change. Is there anything you'd like to comment on there, Barry?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. They're twofold. One is the platforms, as you mentioned, in terms of getting regulators and companies on board for using platforms as a way to accelerate drug development and get medicines to patients faster without having to go through the full rigor of medicine as though it's the very first time it's being given to a human. So I think that has to be addressed, and that's incumbent upon regulators as well as the biopharma companies to work on that. The other question I did have, though, was more along the lines to Max, was ARPA-H is going to be obviously having quite a bit of influence in this area. But my question is, given the focus potentially on cancer and heart disease and diabetes and Alzheimer's, how are rare diseases going to compete with those diseases when it comes to ARPA-H funding and attention?
So thanks for the question, Barry. And thank you also for taking a moment to define what a platform is. I know that word gets thrown around quite a bit without anyone taking time to define it in many cases. So I appreciate you speaking to that. So let me back up just a little bit here. And I'm guessing not everyone who's listening in today has been following ARPA-H. So let me just first begin by explaining what the acronym means, which is the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health. It's basically a cousin, or we'll call it maybe a relative of DARPA, if you've heard of DARPA before. But the idea is that it will provide a new pathway for really catalyzing all manner of health breakthroughs. And these would be activities that are typically outside the purview of an NIH grant or some of the private efforts that are already underway. So it's intended to be very complementary to things that are going on. And so what that means is really driving the development of transformative health technologies with several goals in mind. One could be, the goal of addressing very serious disease, the goal of reducing cost of care, and hopefully eliminating or helping to eliminate some of the health disparities that I think we've become very aware of in recent history. So we think that this model will actually address not one disease, but a whole myriad of disease areas, potentially hundreds, including those that are rare, really by accelerating the development of platform technologies. So as an example of a platform technology, one could look at mRNA technology, which has clearly become extremely important lately. So ARPA-H could be thinking about what are the next platforms that could be funded, what's the next mRNA or next technology that is going to be really transformative across a number of disease areas. So let me also just take a moment to kind of explain the state of play around ARPA-H, because it's as of about a year ago, it was basically a concept. And now I'm really excited to report that we have $1 billion in appropriations. We've actually hired our first official employee, an acting deputy director, who's tasked with really helping to stand up operations for the new agency. And this is basically hot off the presses, but as of Wednesday evening, the House passed an authorizing bill to actually help undergird how the agency will function, and it was passed with a very strong bipartisan vote. And I say that because I think, as folks know, you don't always see that, but it's more evidence that health and health research continues to be a very bipartisan issue on Capitol Hill. So we're hoping to see some Senate legislation advance soon.
Congratulations!
Well,
that's fantastic news.
I know that Tim will support my advocating for RNA as a medicine for a platform to ARPA-H to look at. So,
100%. I wonder, Lena, well, we had talked a little bit about other creative ways that partnerships could be formed. Would you like to ask your question here?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm listening to all as well and to discussion. I'm thinking on the role of the startup companies that come out of academic medical centers. And this is, on my experience, these companies are very close to the patients and are very close to the technology that is available at the medical center. And they allow to, fill that gap up to first in patients if the technology is taken that farther, in the startup company. So my question is about funding. It's and maybe Paula can help me with this. And so what is going on now to support that connection between the newly created academic startup companies and pharma, because it is important to create a tight connection between them so that one can support the other.
So maybe I can, I'll start. So if I understand the question correctly, it's how we can further support that tight connection of the academics, the startup that comes out of academic centers with the patients and then beyond. Is that, did I get that right?
So what maybe I set up a little bit more the situation is that, it's very hard for startups, as especially in the rare disease space, to get funded. And very often we are asked by, do you have a client? Do you have a pharma client? If you don't have a pharma client, then you don't get investments. And we can hear that on and on and on. And I'm grateful with Al, who's also supporting us there. So I wanted to know your opinion and the opinion of pharma on how can we, help that situation? What can be done in that way, in that situation?
Yeah. So I think that what you're saying is that investors are looking to see if there is an outlet for if this becomes a product, that there is some that interest. I mean, of course, as you're setting up a company coming out of an academic institution, you're going to be looking for venture funding or some sort of funding. And they may be able to actually help you quite a bit in terms of shaping the story, the narrative, and how this actually could be seen as a very valuable investment in value creation for a potential investor. It depends obviously on the size of the patient population and the unmet need, and if this solution that you're going after really can address that need. But I do think that where you're seeking funding from venture firms, they can be very helpful, for example, in helping you really pressure test if this is something that is of interest for another company to take on and commercialize. I mean, there are going to be small rare diseases that companies will not take on. I think that's going to have to be a different type of proposition on how to progress the technology for these smaller diseases. And there's several nonprofits that have been funded to really help support moving these types of therapies along. So I'm not sure if you're talking about very small disease or larger that could be of, let's say, commercial interest to a pharma company or a biotech company.
I'm talking
Maybe
about yes, please go.
Maybe I can add from a pharmaceutical perspective. The interest is obviously different if you're talking about a scalable platform. So you're providing a solution that's applicable to more than one disease, because then you have, the wider perspective. What I was alluding to a little earlier, we've seen a lot of investment in platforms, especially supporting development of therapies for rare disorders, especially in gene editing. You can even say it's somewhat comparable to how the industry invested like crazy in antibody manufacturing about 10, 15 years ago, and now we have that in spades. And I'm pretty sure we'll have gene editing in spades in 10 years from now. Which technology will be successful, only time can tell. So there is this need to invest heavily and see what prevails. If it's a single disease and a single solution for a disease, I think you are much better off if you go with a non-for-profit partner to really help that and advance that. Because it's very difficult to scale on that, and depending on the size of the epidemiology and the size of the disease population, it may turn out to be a very challenging value proposition with very high risk. So if you have someone who's willing to carry part of the risk, typically a non-for-profit player, that's probably the way to go.
I add also, I know a few family groups that have gotten together around particular diseases that the disease itself may be really small, but they've actually been able to find a biological mechanism that could translate also into a broader disease, which was mentioned earlier. And this could be extremely powerful, even though your aim is really that rare disease. But if you do have a potential pathway to a broader disease that the rare disease helps validate, give some sort of proof of concept to, that definitely would be of interest to a larger company to invest. So that would be something important to see if there is something biologically supportive of a broader disease as well, that the rare disease really becomes a validating path for.
Thank you.
Well, I'm checking in on the time, and as usual, the time just absolutely flies. I think we'll have to wrap up here on that comment. Thank you for all of your insights and input on the creative solutions to this long tail of rare disease. I'll take the moderator's prerogative and maybe inject one last comment in follow-up of yours, Paula, that I hope that we all can find ways not only to make rare disease work for common disease, but to make rare disease efforts work for other rare diseases too on their own merits. But it sounds like with the ideas and patient-centered efforts and novel financing schemes that we've discussed here and novel technologies, maybe we'll find a path forward. Thanks so much, Andy or Karun,